Hello, everyone. I'd like to be the first to give you a big welcome to the Images in Focus show. My name is David Swindler, and with me is my co-host, Juan Pons. How's it going, Juan?
Hey, David, I'm doing great, and I hope that you're doing great as well. I'm very excited for this new show. I can't tell you how long I've been wanting to do something like this. You know, for those of you that know me a little bit, know that I've been podcasting for over 10 years. And I always felt that the audio only format left a lot to be desired when describing and talking about a visual medium. But I still really enjoyed the two host format where we could go back and forth and interact and talk about things in a very informal way. Thankfully, the technology nowadays is to the point where we can actually do this. I'm in Maine and David is in Seattle, and we can still do this over video, over the internet, and record this show for you guys. So I'm very excited to embark on this new adventure with my good friend David.
That's right. Our goal for this show is to share with you our knowledge and passion for photography. Our shows are not going to be scripted, and you can expect a lot of variety. You know, on some shows we'll discuss a particular topic. On others we'll talk about techniques and/or gear. And on others we'll be out in the field shooting. But we want to hear from you. You know, what kind of questions do you have? What kind of topics would you like us to discuss? You know, we have lots of great ideas going forward, but it's even more relevant when we hear from you. So just send us your thoughts and ideas. Our email is info@imagesinfocus.photo. That's info@imagesinfocus.photo. And we'll also have that in the description down below the video.
Yes, and we also have set up a Facebook group where you can connect with us, and that may actually be an even better medium, so that we can actually interact and go back and forth, not just between you guys and us, but amongst yourselves as well, all of our listeners. And that's going to be facebook.com/groups images in focus. But we'll have a link in the description below as well. So make sure to subscribe to that. So David, why don't you go ahead and get us started on this very first episode?
Yeah, and for our first episode, what we thought we'd do is share 3 images each. And we'll talk about lessons learned and photography tips during our review of these images. And so I'm going to start off here with an image from a trip to the Alaskan Arctic. And this is a wildlife image, of course, with some polar bears. And this was an interesting year. I've been up there numerous times, and most of the time, we have snow when we go. But this year, there was no snow. And Mother Nature is fickle. Sometimes it works according to what we want. Sometimes she doesn't. And the thing about being a nature photographer is that you have to be able to adapt your vision to the current conditions. And so, we didn't have snow, so capturing the polar bears on land, of course, wasn't as ideal. So instead of focusing on the land, we decided to focus more on capturing them out in the water as they're swimming, dunking their heads up and down, and or playing and sparring out in the water. So this was about our second day of the trip, and we found these 2 sub-adults out sparring in the water. And so we were really excited. This is like a perfect photographic moment given our conditions. And so we ventured out and got closer. And what I always tell people with wildlife is that you've got to focus on getting your safe shots first. You don't know when that animal is going to disappear or when that perfect photographic moment is going to vanish. So the first thing is just get a shot. Any shot. Don't worry about getting the perfect composition, the perfect angle, yada, yada, yada. And so that's what we did. We got in position when we got our safety shots. And this is what I consider a safety shot. We got these polar bears as they're sparring back and forth, and, got some great facial expressions, some great water action, and so forth. But one thing I noticed after I kind of got the safety shots is that we had this distracting background back here. And, I'd rather get like all water in the background if I can, make it nice and clean, nice and simple. The other thing that I was paying attention to was my shutter speed. And shutter speed for a shot like this is hugely important. because you have these water droplets flinging off. You need a very fast shutter speed in order to freeze that motion. And so I was shot this one here at 1/1000th of a second. In hindsight, I would have shot this even faster. I would have been about 1/1600th of a second. And that would have given me even sharper water droplets, as these polar bears were sparring.
David, before you keep going, I got a question for you. So you talked about, the background that's a little bit distracting, right? And one of the things you could have done, as you mentioned, is, just have a nice clean water as a background. So, in order to achieve that, you could have moved yourself, right? You could have moved up a little bit and shot down at the bear so that you would get rid of that background, right?
Absolutely. And that's definitely a way you can do that. If I had moved up higher, then I could have put these bears against the water itself, and it would have been a lot cleaner. However, there's also trade-offs to doing so. One of the things that makes this particular shot so compelling is that I am at eye level with these bears. In other words, I'm looking directly at them. I'm seeing them in their full stature. If I were to go higher, the bears would look smaller, and I would not have that eye level perspective.
Yeah, I mean, when you do shoot down at animals, you kind of diminish them in the scene, right? So, and that's something you don't want to do.
Yeah, you definitely don't if you can help it. But sometimes it's worth it, because if you have a super distracting background or a high contrast background, let's say I had like some sky and bright light back here and it was just totally washing things out, then getting up higher and shooting down would be preferable to including all that high contrast in the scene.
Yep, I agree 100%.
And so, it's not that this is a bad shot by any means, but I will tell you it's a shot that I've never published because I didn't really like this noisy, distracting background. And we actually had time to change that. And so, I shot this at 1/1000th of a second. I wasn't enamored with that noisy background. People are going to look at that and be like, what the heck is back there? What is this?
Yeah, it kind of draws your eye a little bit towards it and takes away from your subject, right?
Yeah, it really does, and anything that draws the eye out of the frame or away from your subject is something you just don't want to include if you can help it. And so we were able to reposition while these bears were still playing and able to get it to where we have a nice, clean background here. But I was so excited about capturing this action and this movement that I didn't realize my shutter speed dropped a little bit. And in this shot, I only shot it at 1/640th of a second. And that was just too slow. Look at how the water here is now blurred as the bear's paw hit the other bear.
Now, like you said, you want to have that fast shutter speed. But here, the light looks really nice and sweet. I love the light. But it also, when you have that nice sweet light, it also means that it's not very bright also, right? Exactly. And you want that fast shutter speed. So how did you, what could you have done to get that shutter speed higher?
And so this is a really good question. And actually, a lot of people bring this up when it comes to wildlife shooting.
Yes.
Well, what do I change? How do I ensure that I get fast enough shutter speed? Well, the thing is with these modern cameras, pushing the ISO is not the problem it was 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. Pushing the ISO, you can still get a pretty clean image. In fact, on my Sony cameras, I have no problem going to ISO 1600 if I need to in order to get a faster shutter speed. And so I shot this at ISO 1250. I would have been better pushing up to like ISO 1600 just to ensure that I really got that fast shutter speed here. And I could even go ISO 2000.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, yeah.
No, so I had a question for you as well, because, one of the things, the number one question that I get asked all the time also is, especially with shooting long lenses and wildlife, is, what aperture should you be shooting at, right? Should you be shooting at, f8 or f11 to make sure you have all this stuff, your animal, the entire animal, and some of that background in focus? And, I'm always shooting, and I think you do as well, I'm always shooting, wide open with my long lenses because I'm at a distance from my subjects. And depth of field grows with distance. So, I'm having, even when I'm far away, which I'm sure you were from these bears, when you're far away, even at, F5.6, F7.1, you still have, significant depth of field, right?
Yes, And the other thing too is when you're shooting multiple subjects like this, then depth of field does matter a bit more unless you can get them kind of in the same plane. If you can get them both in the same plane, then you have a lot more depth of field to work with. Both bears can be sharp. But if you have one bear in front, one bear back behind, well, it's almost impossible to render them both sharp unless you're really stopping down a lot more. And so, again, trying to position yourself and waiting for the perfect moment is also really important. But yeah, I agree with you. You want to let in as much light as you can into that scene, and that often means shooting wide open. The benefit of shooting wide open is that it's going to blur out your background more. So if you do have something that's kind of distracting back there, at least it's not going to be as distracting if it's real blurred out. And I shot this at 700 millimeter. I had a 500 millimeter prime lens on the camera with a 1.4x teleconverter. And so, the teleconverter is going to cut down some of that light. So that's why I wasn't able to shoot at fully wide open according to the lens. And that's when you need to push your ISO if you need to get those shutter speeds faster. So yeah, I can fix noise and grain in post. And there's a number of great software options for doing that now, and it's actually pretty incredible at how well some of these software options are for, removing the noise without sacrificing too much of your detail. Juan, are there any noise reducing plugins that you like to use?
Well, it's funny that you mentioned that, because I'm not a person that really uses plugins all that often. Because I do so little editing on my images after I take the shot. But lately I have found myself using Topaz Denoise, because I think it's just unbelievable, especially when you're in very low light situations. Like when I go to Costa Rica, for example, you're down under the forest canopy, and it's actually pretty dark there, and you're using a long lens. You're shooting at f7.1, f8, and your ISO is super high. I've shot images even at 12,800. And it's amazing what software like Topaz Denoise, it's actually beautiful, because what it does is, as when you're reducing noise, what you want to do is you want to reduce noise only in the soft out of focus areas, right? Or the dark areas of the scene, so that you're not blurring sort of the detail that's there, because that's really what noise reduction is doing, is kind of smudging and blurring the scene. Yes. So, like Topaz, one of the great things about it has a built-in auto masking feature that creates just an amazing, beautiful mask, and then applies the noise reduction exactly the way that you want it. So yeah, for me right now, the only plugin that I use, so to speak, and what I use for noise reduction is Topaz Denoise. I think it's unbelievable.
Yeah, and it's really incredible what this newest technology is able to do. I really like Topaz Denoise, and I also will use the NIC define filter. That also works well. I find the NIC filter is much faster at running. So if you just need something that works quickly, the NIC filter is kind of the way to go. If you need something that really gives you the absolute best quality, then the Topaz Denoise is your tool of choice.
Yeah, and Topaz is, like you said, it is slow. It takes quite a while, especially when we're shooting with these, 60 megapixel files now that you were shooting with the A7R4. It just takes forever to process that image. But the end result is, for me, absolute worth it.
Yes, for sure. And so, yeah, we got up on these bears here, and we were able to get a better vantage point to where we got the water behind them instead of that distracting band of land on those barrier islands. And then I was able to get kind of what I call my money shot.
Right.
And see how much more compelling this image is when we have nothing in the background to distract us. The eye goes right to the bears and their interaction. So here's one shot, here's another. And, I noticed that my shutter speed got a little slow in the previous one at 1/640th. And so I went back to 1/1000th of a second. And, I didn't get the water flying off like I did earlier, but I ended up liking these shots so much more, which is why these shots here got published. and this shot here did not. And so when you're out shooting wildlife, really, really pay attention to that background. The background is so important. It's not just the animals and the light and everything like that. It's also the background.
Right. I mean, that background and the fact that you have that background that goes out of focus really just gives you a lot of depth and dimension to the scene. These bears look like they're just popping out of the screen because they just pop out against that really soft, receding out of focus background.
Absolutely. And, there's a lot of people out there that have a negative opinion about chimping, which is basically looking at the back of your camera while you're shooting, reviewing your images. But I will tell you, chimping has saved so many shots for me because it's real-time feedback. I can be out in the field and I can know instantly what I'm doing right, what I'm doing wrong. So I have no problem with people chimping, and in fact, I encourage it. Because how else are you going to know what you can fix when you're in the moment to actually fix it? You don't want to wait till you get home and be like, oh man, I wish I would have seen that. I wish I would have fixed it. No, fix it right then and there.
Well, and that's the advantage, right? That we have now. You and I are both shooting mirrorless, Sony mirrorless, but really mirrorless. And that's one of the advantages that we have is that we can actually preview the image right in our viewfinder after we've taken the shot. We can preview it before we take the shot, but we can also see the end result after we take the shot, which makes it a lot easier than actually looking at the back of the camera. Because you can see that image much more clearly. You're not contending with sun and glare. You don't have to pull out that loop and then look at the back. And while you're doing that, stuff could be happening in front of you that you may be missing. So I agree with you that, what I do encourage people is not so much to delete the images unless they're, grossly out of focus or badly exposed or whatnot. But, oftentimes you can bring an image that is technically, good, but you may be, not sure about the content or the action or whatnot. But then when you look at it on the big screen, it can make a difference. So absolutely. I mean, I think you're right. It's just reviewing the images to make sure that you got your settings correctly, that you're getting what you're thinking, what you're envisioning. And that's where mirrorless really comes in and helps a lot.
Oh, mirrorless is huge in that regard. In fact, that's one of my favorite advantages of mirrorless. Yeah, when I go back to people that have DSLRs and I'm trying to review an image on the back of their screen in bright daylight, it's almost impossible. You just can't get a good idea of how well the shot is composed. It's hard to see if the detail's sharp. Whereas on mirrorless, and I can look right through that viewfinder of the camera, zoom in on the viewfinder, and check and make sure I'm focusing correctly, that I'm using a fast enough shutter speed, that I don't have any distracting objects in my background around the sides of my scene. It's a great tool. But I will say...
So go ahead, finish your thought. Yeah.
Okay, with chimping, just make sure that you're not chimping when there's action going on. Because you don't want to miss it. When things are going, you have to be shooting. But when there's a lull in the action, take advantage of that slight pause to go in and make sure everything's looking correct, that you're not framing things too tightly, that you're not cutting things off, that you're, all the things that we have to think about, when we're shooting wildlife images.
Right, and that your images are in focus. I mean, how many times have we run into that where, someone that needs glasses and they're relying on the autofocus on the camera, and for some reason they hit that switch on the side of the lens and the camera's not focusing, they hadn't realized it. So chimping is definitely super important. But you kind of reminded me of something that I've run into so many times, right? And this is something that I talk about, constantly with workshop students, is that you do not want to evaluate, as much as we chimp and we encourage the chimping, I encourage people not to evaluate the exposure of a particular image by looking at the image on the back of the camera. If you're going to evaluate exposure, you want to do it using the histogram, especially if you're looking at the back of the camera. Because one of the things that I think has been one of the biggest disservice that some of these camera manufacturers did is that they had an adjustable light or adjustable brightness on the back LCD, that the camera adjusted that brightness based on the environmental light, so that when it was sunny out, it would crank that backlighting all the way. And what was happening is that you may have thought that an image was overexposed because the backlight was cranked up all the way when it really wasn't. And the reverse is true. When you're shooting at night, oftentimes, you've run into this, I'm sure, also, David, that when you're shooting at night, people look at the back of the camera and they evaluate the exposure by what they're seeing in the back of the camera. And then they bring that image back home to their computer and it looks like completely black, completely dark. Yes. Because you are evaluating the exposure by looking at the picture on the back of the camera. Do not do that. And turn that automatic brightness adjustment on the back screen of the camera. What you encourage people to do is to set that manually to a fixed brightness level. So at least that gave you, because I know it's hard not to evaluate exposure by looking at the picture. You should really be looking at the histogram, not the picture. Mm-hmm. But we're all guilty of doing it. So at least set it fixed so that it doesn't vary. Now the same thing goes when you're looking through the viewfinder on the mirrorless. If you want to evaluate the exposure, which is a lot easier to do in a situation like that, also set the brightness to a fixed value. Do not let it fluctuate just because of ambient light conditions. So that's my sort of tip of the day.
Excellent pro tip. Yeah. The other thing I'll add is on your camera menu, make sure you enable the highlight clipping alert.
Yes.
And that's where if you blow out, or if you're within like 10% of blowing out those highlights, it'll kind of blink on your camera screen and let you know where those problematic areas might be. And that's important if you're shooting something like a polar bear where you have white fur. I don't want to blow that out. Yes. I'd like to know if I'm getting close to the clipping margin for those bright highlights. So I find that highlight clipping alert to be very useful.
Yeah, I memean, that's great. And we're going down deep here into a lot of different techniques and whatnot, which is good. But, one of the things you want to make sure that you're doing, just like David mentioned, is you want to make sure that you are exposing to the right or exposing for the highlights. And this is basically the same thing we used to do when we shot slide film, in that you wanted to make sure that you were not blowing out those highlights, but that you were moving the exposure to the right of the histogram. You're making the image a little brighter because one of the things that's going to do, we could spend a whole hour talking about this, but sensors gather more data on the bright side of the spectrum of tonalities. So the brighter your overall image is, the more data you're going to have in order to do editing, when you bring that image into Photoshop or Lightroom or whatever it is. And the converse or the opposite of that is, if you think about noise likes to live in the shadows. This is a little phrase that I try to tell people to help them remember. Noise likes to live in the shadows. So if you're exposing your images and you're taking that slider in Lightroom or Photoshop or whatever, and you're moving it to the right to brighten your image, you're exacerbating the noise that's there. So to the best of your ability, try not to move those exposure sliders to the right. Or, the shadow slider, we end up moving quite a bit, to the right to bring us some detail in the shadows. But the less you move it to the right, the better. Because every time you move those sliders to the right, you're going to be exacerbating the noise that's there. Because noise is there no matter what. So by increasing those sliders, what you're doing is exacerbating. So in all things being equal, you're better off moving the sliders to the left, right? Because you're not introducing noise when you're making the image a little darker. But you got to make sure that you don't, move it, or you don't overexpose the image. Because once you're overexposed and you blow out those highlights, you're done for. You're lost all the detail there. It's kind of like, the analogy that I give people is, when you're near a cliff, the closer you get to the edge, the better the view. But if you take that last step, you're completely done for. So it's sort of like that. You want to get close to that edge, but not take that last step. And it's the same thing with exposure.
Absolutely. Well, Juan, thank you for the feedback and the great tips. Let's move on to one of your images.
Sounds great. Let's take a look at this image. And this image is probably one of my better known images. And I shot this in Yellowstone, I can't remember, a number of years ago, maybe 8, 9, 10 years ago, somewhere like that. I can't remember. And I like to use this image a lot for illustrative purposes, actually to reinforce some of the things that David talked about. And, one of the things here that I'm trying to do is trying to gain perspective on these animals. Now, we talked about, when David was trying to make sure that the bears were not, didn't have a distracting background to them, that they had a nice, clean background. One of the things I said, you could go a little higher, right, to try to get them against the water, so you get rid of that background. And his response is absolutely, you could do that, but one of the trade-offs is that you're going to lose that eye-to-eye connection with your subject. And this is where I'm going with this image. Here, I wanted to make sure that I had this really nice eye-to-eye connection with my subjects. And one of the challenges here is that we're kind of in this slope area. So if I'm standing as I'm shooting these animals, one of the things that's happening is that, I may still have a nice connection, eye-to-eye connection with my leading subject here, the bison on the right. But what would happen is those bison in the background would actually start getting smaller and smaller, and they look more diminishing. So in order for me to expand upon the scene that's unfolding in front of me and make those animals that are in the background bigger and more impressive, one of the things that I did is that I lay down on the ground to be able to have a much lower perspective. Oftentimes, I want to be able to shoot my subjects at least at eye level, if not just below eye level, a little bit below eye level, because one of the things that does is it elevates those subjects. It makes them bigger in the scene and makes them more impressive and more regal. I can use 50,000 different adjectives to describe that. But so one of the things I did here is to kind of get down low, and I was actually laying on my back with a lens kind of going down my belly, and I was holding it up with my knees. To not just gain that lower perspective on that front animal, but also one of the things that did is that it actually, because it changed my perspective between me, my subject, which is the front animal, and the background, which is the background animals, it actually made them bigger in the scene. It didn't, reduce them in size comparatively to the ones in the front. As you can see here, these animals, all of them, their feet start higher than our leading animal, and that's because I was down lower. Had I been shooting from a standing position or even higher up to get, see more of them, they would have actually been diminished, and they would have looked a lot smaller, compared to our leading subject here. Now, the other thing that I was trying to do is sort of capture the essence of the moment, in essence of the environment that these guys are in. So I wanted to shoot kind of a more expansive shot. Didn't want to just zoom in on my leading subject. I wanted to include all of them and include a little bit of the background in that snow as it's coming down. Now, capturing that snow coming down can sometimes be challenging because it depends on the type of snow that's falling. In this case, one of the ways to do that, I'm going to show you an image later on, a different technique to capture the snow is to have a very slow shutter speed, so the snow streaks. But that only works in certain situations. And the snow needs to be kind of big, and it needs to be kind of falling slower. This kind of snow that's falling right now, it's smaller and it falls a little faster. And I'm also contending with the movement of the animals in front of me. So I'm kind of gauge all these different factors that are going on in order to capture the image in the environment that I want to capture it in. And then the last thing that I want to talk about is that depth of field issue that we talked about earlier. I'm shooting here actually a pretty wide open. I believe this is 5.6, if not f8, somewhere around there. And you can see that I do have a nice sharp leading bison, but I start losing a little bit definition, on that bison, on the ones as you go down the line of that front bison. And then the ones in the background, I still have enough definition on them because, again, I'm shooting with a long lens, I'm at a distance, so my depth of field is being extended out. So I'm able to see, they don't become just a complete blur in the scene. I'm actually being able to get a little bit more definition on them. Then I'm also trying to capture, for example, the movement here. The leading bison and the bison on the left, the second one in line, they both have their hoofs up in the air. That gives you another sense of movement in the scene. So it's not
Yes.
just a bunch of bison standing around. There's a little bit of, making the image a little bit more dynamic by including some movement in there.
Absolutely. And Juan, I think, the point you brought up is absolutely critical. You want to be able to shoot the wildlife at eye level or slightly below. I tend to prefer that slightly below look because it does really augment the wildlife's posture and
Yes.
stature.
Yeah,
Make,
absolutely. I mean, yeah, you said it right. Posture and stature. Stature is the right word. So that's great.
yes. And the other thing, too, with an image like this that makes it work is you have balance in the scene. You have bison on either side to help balance it. If we didn't have that, it might feel like the image is a little lopsided. And that's something that can be hard to do because I can't tell the wildlife where to go, especially when you have a group of
Right.
animals.
Right.
But you can reposition yourself so that you can achieve that proper balance when you're shooting them.
Yeah, and it's kind of funny that you mentioned that because this particular scene, I've actually talked about this image in the past, and those of you that know me probably would have heard the story many times. And I'm not going to go into the story about this image, but one of the things that I was doing is exactly that. Not only did I get low, but then, I was wiggling around like a worm, if you will, to move to the left or to the right to try to compose that image.
Yeah.
In all the presentations that I give, the very first slide that I show, very first slide on every presentation that I give is don't take images, right? You want to make images, and that's an active process. And that active process is like David said. I can't position the animals. I can't tell them what to do. But what I can do is I myself can move to change that relationship between myself, my subject, and its background. So I'm moving a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right to try to position them in such a way that balance the image, but still, provided a hint, even though, when I have so many animals, I can't avoid collisions between all the different subjects, but I can optimize that collision, if you will, to make sure that people can tell exactly what it is. And there's 10, 20 animals there versus just one big blob of an animal, because you're seeing more contours, you're seeing more legs, you're seeing, again, you're optimizing that composition, if you will, by just, oftentimes is just moving a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right. What's the phrase that you like to say? Sometimes it's a matter of inches.
Oh, photography is totally a game of inches.
Right.
Sometimes just moving 1 inch to the right or to the left or up or down can make the difference between an award-winning image and just a snapshot. And that's true in landscape photography, wildlife photography, macro photography, whatever it is. You have to pay so much attention to these small little shifts. That's why I tell people, look through your camera a lot. You can't see with your own eyes what the camera is seeing through that particular lens. You have to be able to visualize things through your camera. And so before you go and set up that tripod in a spot, look through that camera a lot. Look up and down, figure out where that optimal position is going to be first.
One of the things that it always baffles me and it just drives me crazy, and something that I really encourage people on my workshops is to move around as much as possible. How often do you see somebody takes their camera out, with a tripod, they set it up, and they don't move from that spot for an hour. And they just keep shooting and shooting and shooting. And you're like, what are you doing? You're making the same shot over and over again. Yeah, the light may be changing, but there's not much difference. Move around. It's funny. I ran into this past, I didn't realize how much this drove me nuts until last summer. I was with the family out in Mount Rainier. We did every summer we go on a family vacation, and this year we went out to the Olympic Peninsula and Mount Rainier, which my family had never been to. I've been there many, many times. And, we went to Reflection Lakes, and we were at Reflection Lake in the morning to watch the sunrise there and watch the reflection. And, obviously I had my camera out. And there was a workshop there and a few other people shooting. And people kind of like, got there first thing, and they set up their little fiefdoms, their little camps in their one spot, and literally did not move for an hour. And they were shooting the same, as the sun was coming up, and the light was just shooting the same image over and over and for like an hour. They didn't change position, they didn't trade, they didn't do anything. And I was like, I'm not here in a workshop. I'm just here on my own trying to enjoy this. And this is driving me nuts. The fact that these guys are not moving. That's when I really realized how badly that drives me nuts. you gotta get around and move around and try to make different compositions. And I will tell you, I've shot that same place and that same scene many, dozens of times over the years. And that morning I thought I made the great, one of my better images of that particular location. And it wasn't until I looked at my images afterwards that the very last spot that I actually shot from, which was some, out of, that no one had been to, was kind of the best shot because it had the best arrangements of wildflowers in the foreground. So it just goes to show just moving around a little bit can make a huge difference. Like you said, it's a matter of inches, right?
Oh, it totally is. And definitely a great tip for you. Be active. Don't just set up in one spot.
Yeah, don't you move around, please. Okay, David, you want to talk about the next image?
Absolutely. So this is kind of a landscape image, but it also includes a human subject. And I thought I would discuss some of the things that go on in composing an image like this. So we started the day very early and we started skiing up this ridge, and after it was completely fogged in, we couldn't see anything up above us. And we climbed for about a couple thousand vertical feet, and all of a sudden we started getting to the fog layer. And it wasn't long before we broke above it and we could see all these glorious, beautiful mountains around us. So I started looking around for where a good composition might be. And I saw this little ridge line that jutted out and, it kind of formed this cornice here. And I was like, oh, that'd be the best spot to get someone standing out there where we can compose them with this amazing mountain peak on the other side of the fog. And so my buddy Tim volunteered. He's like, sure, I'll go out there. So he skied out and he couldn't get too close to the edge of this little ridge here because this is a cornice. And if any of you have traveled in the mountains in the wintertime, you'll know that cornices in winter are very dangerous. They can give away even 5-6 feet away from the edge of them, sometimes even further back. And so you never want to go close to the edge of them. This obviously doesn't have a lot of consequence on this side of the cornice, but some cornices you could fall 1,000 feet if one happened to give away, and they would probably also start an avalanche, and that would be really bad. And so I couldn't get him out on the very edge here from this particular perspective. But the thing I noticed when I started chimping and looking at this shot later is that he didn't really stand out that well because he's against this dark background right here. And I started thinking, well, how can I actually make this image better? And so, this particular shot here, this is just a raw file straight out of camera. I never edited it because my next shot ended up being so much better. And so my girlfriend, Evelyn, said, hey, I want to go out there and get a shot too. And so while she's skiing out there, making sure that she followed the same ski track so we can keep it nice and clean, I started looking at my shots and realized, what if I got up just a little bit higher and put my subject against the fog here rather than against this dark, distracting mountain? Well, you know what? That made all the difference. By going up a little higher, it achieved that objective, but it also allowed me to see the full ski track going out. This right here is a powerful leading line because it takes my eye from the edge of the frame, leads me right to my subject standing here and looking out towards the next thing I want my viewer to focus on, which is this amazing mountain peak. So the eye follows this line, goes to the subject, then from the subject up to this mountain peak, we stay here for a little while. There's nothing up here in the sky that makes my eye want to leave the frame. And then next it circles around down to the fog band. I see the light hitting these rocks over here on the side. I'm intrigued by the light and shadow that I have right here. And then my eye kind of circles back around, follows the ski track back in. This is a technique, a compositional technique where we're trying to keep the viewer's eye locked in that frame. If there's anything in this frame that's going to allow the viewer's eye to kind of escape the frame, well, now we've just lost the viewer's interest. And the composition is not going to be nearly so compelling. And so one thing, that we've been kind of been the theme of this show today is you have to be active as a photographer. Where I was right here, where you can't even see the full ski track, the subject isn't, in the right spot and everything. This is right along what I call the trail. And, as we're walking along, we're going to just kind of stay on that trail uh, by default. But to make good images, you often have to go off the trail. You have to climb up that little steep ridge right next to you, or go climb down a little bit to kind of clean up your composition. And that's what I had to do. There was a nice kind of trail that we were skiing along, but I had to climb up the ridge a little bit, and all of a sudden it transformed the entire image.
Another aspect of this that I love. I mean, this image is perfect because, like you said, it has that perfect flow, a visual flow that guides your eye with a leading line, follows that ridge line, back to the bright parts of the scene on the left and goes back around. So it's just a perfect sort of flow. And, not every image has that. But it's just awesome when it does. But the other thing that really makes this image stand out to me, not just the fact that Ellen is against the fog bank there, really bringing her out, but it's also the pose. We talked about pose before, right? The animals. Now as opposed to the human in this case, or a different kind of animal. It's a much better pose where you can actually see more definition. You can actually see what this person is doing, that they're skiing, because you can see the ski pole, all that stuff. You can see it in there. Much better than the previous one where the person was just sort of standing there, kind of looking back at you. So definitely kudos for having her kind of in a better pose, and kudos for getting off that the main road that you were in, right, and getting off the road and off a little bit to compose a different to make that image versus taking that image.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Juan. Let's go ahead and discuss another one of yours.
So let's take a look here. Hold on a second. I gotta change my settings here. Oops. So I'm running on the background here, the kind of all the technical stuff. So sometimes it takes me a little bit to switch from one screen to another. But this is another image from Yellowstone. Again, we're kind of going back with this theme of winter, it seems. But Yellowstone is one of my favorite places in the world. It's just it's an amazing place where the landscape changes every year. It's different. There's not any two trips out to Yellowstone are the same. And the wildlife is different. The experience is different. The weather is different. The snow is different. Everything about it is different. And this is an image I made a few years ago. I absolutely love foxes. Red foxes to me, I don't know what it is about them, but they totally captivate me. And we get to photograph and see these guys from time to time. And one of the great things about this particular image that I like is that we can actually see, the environment that these animals need to endure in order to survive in Yellowstone. You really get a sense of the harsh weather conditions. Again, one of the things I needed to do was move to be able to get the right perspective on my subject. Initially, when we first encountered this fox, most of what I had as a background was snow. Meaning that, and when I say snow, I mean snow on the ground. Meaning that I could not really show, what the weather conditions were like in that situation. Now, what I wanted to do, as I talked about earlier, is exacerbate or bring out, if you will, what the snow was doing at that particular time. We had, a pretty intense snow blizzard taking place where the snow was really going horizontal, as they say. And when I was shooting at my normal shutter speed, which in a situation like this would have been, at least 500th of a second, probably 1,000th of a second to try to capture, my animal nice and sharp while I was moving, I decided to go the opposite way. And I believe this image is close to, a fifth of a second or something like that, if I remember correctly. And one of the things I was trying to capture by slowing my shutter speed was to capture that snow as it's moving. Like I said before, the conditions need to be right in order for you to be able to capture that. You have to kind of measure this snow, if you will, in your head to try to figure out, will this work? And then all you can do is, test it out and see if it works. Now, one of the challenges here is I had a fox that was also moving. So I knew that my fox was going to be somewhat blurred as well. But another technique that I could employ in this particular situation was panning. I was trying to pan with my fox, and then I was shooting at a high frame rate, shooting a lot of different images, hoping that one of them will be sharp enough, that at least the eye, the face, was sharp enough for the image to work. Because if the eyes are not sharp, if you're not focused on the eyes and the eyes are not clear and your viewer can't make a connection with your subject through the eyes, then the image is just not going to work. In this case, most of the fox actually is somewhat blurred by the movement. Certainly the legs are, as you can notice here, but the eyes are sharp. You can make that connection to that subject, and you can look into that subject eye. As I mentioned earlier, my initial position was one where I could only see snow, so I needed on the ground. So I needed to have the flying or the snow that's in the air against a darker subject in order for it to highlight. So, I needed to get down lower in order to position those trees, lower in the scene, and have that contrast of this. The fox would have had contrast against the snow or the trees. Wouldn't matter, but that snow, I wanted to really show that snow. So, sometimes trying to think a little bit out of the box, my initial reaction and most people's initial reaction would have been to do a fast shutter speed to capture the action, to freeze the motion. But I think that those slow shutter speeds where you get that blur or that motion in the scene can actually make very, very powerful images. I mean, this image for me is, one of my all-time favorites. Part of it is because of the subject, part of it is because of the location, and part of it is because of the feeling of the image. I actually have this image printed right above my computer over here, and what is this, like 3 feet by 4 feet high or something like that. And for me, it really works. Again, it's a little different of an image that you would normally see of a fox in the snow in the winter. But sometimes when we play around and try to think outside the box, we come up with something that works.
Yeah. And one thing about the best photos is that they tell a powerful story. And for me, that's what you did with this slower shutter speed panning technique, is that you're telling the story of this harsh winter environment. I can see how the wind is blowing that snow, and you just feel the cold. And you can see this fox trying everything in its power to survive against these difficult conditions. So that's what really drives home the power of this image is the story it tells. And by thinking outside the box like you did and trying a little different technique, you're able to do that.
Well, the thing is, people don't think about this, but when the weather gets bad, we can go in, cozy up next to a fire, grab a latte or hot chocolate and relax. Animals can't do that. They have to eat. They have to endure. And, in a situation like this where you have a storm, even more so because the temperatures are dropping, the weather is not, cooperating, and they need to go out and hunt to feed themselves and to stay warm.
Absolutely. So I love this image. It's one of my favorites of yours too. And I think for a future episode that we could do a more in-depth tutorial on how to do this slow shutter speed panning, because it's quite an advanced technique and there's a lot of nuances that you need to know in order to be successful at it.
Yeah, absolutely. And, and one of the things that, and I'm sure you run into this too, is that people get frustrated, right, very fast because they do it and it just doesn't work. And, like you said, there's lots of nuances to it, but it's also a numbers game as well. I can tell you I probably had 50 other images, in that little sequence of, and there's only one that sequence that really just worked compared to all the other ones. So, yeah, you got to have the technique down, but you also have to give yourself a break, so to speak, because it does, it's almost like a crapshoot. Not quite a crapshoot, but it does take, it's a numbers game. You got to make a lot of images to hope to get one or two images that really work.
Absolutely. And that's what I love about digital photography.
Yes, absolutely. I agree. Okay, let's look at your next image here.
All right, so this is an image I took a couple days ago. And of course, I'm in Seattle right now, and one of my favorite icons of Seattle is the Space Needle. And one thing I've always wanted to do is get that big full moon shot with the Space Needle. And I noticed, looking at all the angles, that this month was the month to make it all happen. Now, the moon angles change every single month, and so just because it rises or sets at one angle this month doesn't mean it's going to be the same angle the next month. Every month is going to be different. And so I went around and did some very careful planning the day before to try to make sure I could get in the perfect spot, because precision is of utmost importance if you're going to be shooting a shot like this at 600 millimeters. And, so this is a shot I took here at 600 millimeters. I was far enough back so that I could focus once and have the Space Needle and the moon be sharp. That means that they're both at infinity focus. But let me just talk to you a little bit about the planning aspect of this shot so you can understand kind of what went into it. And so I like to use two different apps for planning. They are PhotoPills and TPE, or the Photographer's Ephemeris. PhotoPills is my app of choice when I'm on the ground in the field, and TPE is what I like to use when I'm at a computer looking at things from a more precise type of view. And so for this demonstration, I will show you TPE since I can show you it right from my computer screen. They have a web-based version that is free for anyone to use. And what I did is I went in and I found the Space Needle right here, and I marked this as one of my pins. Then I marked a secondary pin in alignment with my moon angle. Now, down here it'll tell you on the particular day you're looking at what the sunrise time is, what the moon set time is, what percentage full the moon's going to be. And in order to get the moon looking like I had it here, this needs to be shot before the sun comes up. Because if you wait until sunrise, and I took a shot just to kind of show you what it would look like, this is a shot right at sunrise. You can see how much more washed out the moon is. It just doesn't look good. But shooting this at 20 minutes before sunrise makes a huge difference. You're going to get more blue in that sky. You're going to get a lot more contrast and detail in that moon. The other thing to pay attention to is what is the angle above the horizon you need the moon to be at. And using TPE, I could figure that out. So I figured, okay, I need to be somewhere probably around 6 degrees above the horizon. And, right here it tells me where I place this secondary pin, that's 1.9 kilometers away from the Space Needle. And I know that the Space Needle is right around 200 meters tall. And so if I do just a little high school trigonometry, I can take 200 meters over 1.9 kilometers and calculate that angle. That angle happens to be 6 degrees above the horizon. Now, if I'm using an app like PhotoPills, for example, and I'm using strict landscape features, in other words, I'm going from one ridge line up to like the top of a mountain, well, it can actually calculate that angle for me because it knows exactly the heights of both of those locations. But if I'm shooting something like the Space Needle, well, the app's not going to know the altitude of the tip of the Space Needle. So I'm going to have to calculate that manually. So that's a little bit different, a little bit more advanced of a technique. But it's still not hard to do. Easy mathematics. You can even just go on a web browser and have it calculate that angle for you if you need to. And so once I kind of determined where I needed to be from the app here, I went and did the boots on the ground technique. This is super important. There's nothing that can compensate for actually being on ground in that location ahead of time. and especially when you're in a city environment, because you need to find an area where you're going to have a clean view. There's not going to be like power lines in the way, trees, other buildings, street lights. And you also want to make sure that you can get high enough up so that your angles are going to work. You don't want to be too far off from what you calculated. And then once I'm on the ground, I can use an app like PhotoPills and stuff to kind of verify my work, to check that all the angles are going to be correct. And so since I knew I wanted to be about 20 minutes before sunrise, down here on this lower bar, I can put in the exact time I'm wanting. So sunrise is at 5:40. Well, I knew I want to be about 5:20. And so at 5:20, you can see here that my angle of the moon is indeed going to be 6 degrees above the horizon. I wouldn't want to wait until moon set, because now it's going to be so low, I wouldn't be able to see it with the Space Needle. So these apps that we have nowadays make planning so much easier compared to the days when we had to get out a map and compass and use the protractor to measure angles and so forth. Those days are gone. It's so much easier now.
But talk about making an image, right? We just talked about that. And here you really had to calculate, the time of day to be in, the day of the year to be on, because this was, if I believe correctly, this is the last supermoon of 2020, correct?
That is correct. And the advantage of shooting a supermoon is that it's going to appear about 10% larger in your image.
Right.
Which, when you're shooting at 600 millimeter, can be pretty significant.
Right. I mean, that's what the 600 millimeter is doing too, right? It's actually, because it's compressing the scene, it's making that moon be even bigger than what it normally would look like when you're shooting with a normal focal length lens. So yeah, talk about, making an image versus taking an image. You had to plan the day of the year, the time, the location, the angle that you wanted to shoot at, and then, what the light was going to be at that particular moment, versus the rising sun, because that's going to make a big difference, like you said. So pretty well done. That's awesome. Very cool.
Yeah. The washed out image is not nearly the same impact.
Right.
As just 20 minutes before. Timing is everything in photography.
Well, it's funny because, I'm sure you've run into this too. I've had a lot of people that want to take images of the moon in the middle of the night. And they want to include the foreground, or they want to include the landscape in the shot in the middle of the night. I'm like, that you could do that, but you're going to have to bracket the image. You're going to have to do compositing and whatnot, because the contrast between the moon, which is insanely bright, compared to the foreground, is just not going to allow you to capture everything in one scene. So you want to find that right time in the morning or in the evening, when this light from the sun is a little softer, that matches the intensity of that of the moon as well. You want to be able to capture both scenes in there.
Absolutely. And one topic for a future show, I think, would be, how do you actually shoot the moon? Like, what kind of settings do you use in your camera? And, how do we make things as best as they possibly can be? And so I'd like to throw that out there as a topic for one of our future episodes. We could talk for a good hour on, how to shoot the moon with different types of phases, different types of landscapes, and so forth.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. And folks, like we said at the beginning, if this is a topic you'd like us to talk about, make sure to let us know. Put send us a message on the Facebook group or via email, one or the other, and let us know. Maybe perhaps what we can do, David, is make a little poll on our Facebook group so that people can choose from 10 different topics and whatnot, and rate them and tell us, and maybe even suggest topics for us to cover. That way, at least I know that oftentimes when you just leave it wide open for people, they don't know what to say, or they're a little gun shy about speaking up. But when you make a poll, it allows people to actually provide a little feedback more directly.
Yeah, and I really like that idea, Juan. Let's do it.
Yeah, let's do it. Because already we've in this conversation we've come up with a couple of different topics that we could use for a future episode. So I think that's great.
All right, Juan. Well, I'll let you take it away with our last image for the show.
Okay. Oops, so nope, that's not the screen I wanted to. This is the screen I want to show people. This is, and I've actually lately been showing this image quite a bit. This is an image I took in 2018, I believe, in the Gaspé Peninsula of Quebec. This is not near Quebec City. This is east of Quebec City, actually on a tiny little island on the Atlantic shore of the Gaspé Peninsula in Quebec in Canada. And I went there. Actually, I want to show you here real quick the what this area looked like. This is a gannet colony that has, this particular year, if I remember correctly, they had 60,000 pairs. I believe that's the number.
Wow.
Of gannets in a couple of different colonies. Just unbelievable number of gannets, and it's kind of really inspiring place. So when I was here, it was for me, making images of birds in flight is kind of like second nature, right? I'm making images like this one, which I absolutely love, but they don't really tell me much about the interaction of what's going on with the birds. I much prefer images that tell a little bit of a story, that allow a connection to be made, whether it's between the viewer and the subject or between subjects, that then spills over, if you will, to our viewer. So one of the things I was trying to capture was, in this sea of gannets, they all look exactly the same. You immediately start wondering, how do they find each other? When one of the pair goes out to sea to get some fish and bring it back to the nest to feed its young, how do they find each other? To me, that's just, kind of a miracle of, one of the miracles of life, one of the big unknowns of life. And I wanted to try to capture that. I wanted to try to capture, one of the pair coming in to, coming in from fishing to feed, its young or its mate. And, I worked on that really hard, tried to look for that particular moment, again, trying to tell a story, trying to tell a little bit more about my subject than just a pretty picture of a bird in flight, which I still love. But to me, an image that tells that story, that tells me a little bit about their life history, are much more interesting. Now, a couple of things here from a technical perspective. I want to talk about some of the things I had to take into consideration when making this image. First is that I'm dealing with extremely difficult subjects to photograph, because these guys are pure white for the most part, but they have very, very dark parts to them. Around the eye is really, really, really black. The web feet are super black as well, which presents a challenge in exposure when you're trying to make those whites and those darks and capture as much information on both extremes of that exposure. Now, lucky for me, that day that I was there, it was an overcast day. I had strong light, but it was overcast, so the light was really nicely diffused, but still was strong enough to cast some shadows on my subject, which you always want, because those shadows provide detail and definition and provide depth to the scene. So as we talked about earlier, one of the things that I was doing is trying to make sure that my exposure was spot on the birds. When I'm shooting birds in flight, this is about the only time that I shoot in full manual with my camera. That means no auto ISO. You set my shutter speed, set my aperture, and set that exposure to the highlights, to the birds, to the white of the birds. So make sure that it's nice and white, but not overexposed. I want to be able to retain and be able to see some of that texture on the white of the birds. Now, why would I shoot that in manual when I'm doing birds in flight? Is because when I'm shooting birds in flight, the bird tends to be a small part of the entire scene that you're shooting, that you're seeing through your viewfinder. And what's happening is with the camera is that the camera is looking at that background and trying to set the exposure for that background, because the background is the largest percentage-wise portion of the scene. And if you're tracking a bird and that bird goes between sky, a cloud, or trees or the ocean, well, that exposure is going to change based on that background. By me setting my camera manual and setting the exposure on the bird, I can be assured that my bird is going to be properly exposed every single time. I will have to deal with the background and deal with, where the exposure may lie there. But for me, that is the only way to shoot birds in flight is full manual. Otherwise, 98% of the time I'm shooting in aperture priority. That's just the way that I think and the way that I photograph. But for birds in flight, it's full manual. Now, the other thing that I had to take into consideration here, like David did at the very beginning, is, what was going to be my proper shutter speed. If I remember correctly, this image was shot at 1/1000th of a second or thereabouts. And, if you look closely at this image and I'm going to zoom in here on the wings, you can see that there's a little bit of motion blur on the tip of the wings. But the rest of the bird is really nice and sharp. And you may ask yourself, why are the wingtips blurred? Why didn't I want to freeze the wingtips? Well, typically, I like to have a little bit of blur on those wingtips to give me a sense of motion. If the entire bird was completely frozen in time, frozen in the air, it almost seems like the bird is just hovering. It's being held by strings or something like that. It doesn't look as natural to me. So I want to have a tiny bit of motion blur on the tips of those wings. If I wanted to freeze those wings, I'd be shooting higher, from 1/1600th of a second, 1/2000th of a second, or something like that, because those wingtips are moving a lot faster than the rest of the wing. And if you want to make sure that those wingtips are sharp, you have to shoot that fast shutter speed. So for me here, the what makes this image what I was shooting for was to capture the interaction between the pair of gannets, as the one that's coming in from fishing comes in, finds its mate, and comes in for landing. And the follow-up to that image is these two guys together, kind of reinforcing their bond and saying hello to each other as they land.
Yeah, Juan, and kind of harkening back on the theme of this episode is, we're telling stories here with our photography. And I love that image where the bird is coming in and it makes that eye contact with its mate, because that's what tells the story of what's happening here. And so often when I'm shooting wildlife, I like the shots more where I'm maybe zoomed out a little more and showing the animal in the grander context of its environment.
Yes.
And what it's doing, what's around it, what are the other animals in its vicinity doing. And the reason why is because it does tell a story. Just a frame-filling portrait shot of an animal doesn't tell the same story as when you see it zoomed out a little more and seeing exactly what it's doing. And also, like you said, shooting with that slightly shorter shutter speed, that adds the motion to the shot. That adds dynamism. And that also enhances the story you're telling.
Yeah, thank you. You're absolutely right. And I think that, one of the things is that, and there's nothing wrong with that closed-in shot of the bird in flight. Like I showed you, I have a few of those from that particular shoot, and I love those as well. But to me, those are more like artistic shots, if you will, right, of these birds in flight, that they just look like pieces of artwork. Yes. Whereas the other one, which is to me more of a natural history shot, which tells you a little bit of history, a little bit of the background, a little bit of the environment, tells you something about the subject that you're seeing. And for me, those are the images that connect the most. I mean, I love the artistic shots, right? The beautiful, gannet in the air with its wings out. It looks like an angel. And so it's still a great image, but, to me, the other one just connects more, because it also, the other thing that it does, which is another trick to use to make images interesting, is kind of tugging at your emotional strings, right? The reunion of these two birds is when one went out fishing and came back. That emotion is kind of universal, and it kind of pulls on us and brings us into the image that much more.
Yes, and photos that can evoke that emotional response are going to be so much more enticing to us. The other thing, too, is that a shot like what you showed transports the viewer to that location. 99% of people will never get to see that, except through your photos.
Right.
So being able to transport them there, then that makes it really cool to the viewer.
Right, and the fact that you have all these animals that look exactly identical, and how they find each other is just it's just beyond me. It's just that's one of the wonderful things about nature, and why I do what I do. It's why I love being out there. Because for me, it's the photography is quite honestly is secondary to the experience. I love the experience. To me, that's really though I've been a photographer for over 30 years now. What drew me into, photographing wildlife is because it allowed me to be out in the elements, out in nature, with a purpose. So because I have that purpose of making the images, it kind of forces me to observe and to experience it a lot more than if I were just, traipsing around looking at stuff, right?
Yep. And someone told me about a poll once that they did with some professional landscape photographers, and they asked them, if you could still do all these hikes and go to these amazing locations, but you couldn't take your camera with you, would you still go? A large number of them actually said no.
Right.
And I was like, what? For me, like you say, the experience is primary. Being there in person, watching that amazing sunrise, that is what it's all about.
Yes.
And then capturing the image comes secondary.
I can't tell you, it's kind of funny because you've seen the Life of Walter Mitty, right?
Yes. Uh-huh.
And that scene that I'm talking about near the end where Sean Penn, he finally has a snow leopard, and he's going to photograph, and he puts the camera down and he starts, I've done that any number of times because, as much as I love shooting them and capturing them and being able to relive the experience afterwards, the camera to a certain extent does stand in between you and that experience, And I think you cannot fully absorb that experience when you're trying to focus on the camera and thinking about composition and thinking about the settings, all this kind of stuff. You're just not as immersed in the moment. So there's been many times where, after I made the image that I wanted to make, or even I didn't make the image, or even before I made the image, I just sat there and absorbed the moment, just to really experience it and kind of like incorporate it into my being before taking the shot or after taking the shot. I still took the shot. In most cases, there's times where I just didn't because the moment passed. But if I had to choose between the two, I would choose the experience every time.
Absolutely. Those are the memories that you'll treasure for years and years to come.
Right. The image, it's so funny because one of the things that oftentimes when I give presentations, I tell people, my presentations are mostly images with some, information behind them, but it's not typical, bullet point kind of stuff. It's really more about the images and talking about the images. And I tell people that if they have a question about an image, to make sure to ask me. Every image has a story behind it. Some are better than others. But the amazing thing is that every image that I have, I can tell you exactly where I was and what was happening at that moment. Because that experience is in me. Whereas a lot of other people that may shoot an image, they won't remember where they shot it or where, I can tell you even, I've been to Yellowstone. I've been doing workshops in Yellowstone for almost 16 years, without fail every year. And any of those images that I just showed you from Yellowstone, I can tell you exactly where I was standing when I shot each one of those images, even though I've taken thousands of images there. It's just there's something about it in capturing that experience, internally makes it's what this is all for me. This is what it's all about.
Absolutely.
Well, David, what do you think of our first episode? I think we did pretty well here.
Yeah, I think it was informative, and we were able to cover a lot of really interesting principles, give some great pro tips, and actually also come up with some more topics for future discussions. So Juan and I are really excited to bring you lots more episodes coming up. We're going to really expand your knowledge base and get you excited to get out there and take those amazing shots.
Absolutely. And, please do get in touch with us. Let us know what you think of this episode. If you have suggestions for improvements or things you'd like to see, things you'd like us to change, we love to hear from you guys and understand what you guys are looking for. What do you think, what kind of information is what you are most interested in? There's a lot of educational stuff out there on YouTube, on the internet, on photography. And a lot of it, I feel that it's like, kind of a talking head, talking at people. We want to be able to have a conversation with you guys. And, there'll be situations, I think, I can envision situations where we may bring some of you on air to talk to us and ask us questions and have a discussion with us. But we'd like to have a discussion with you guys by you telling us what kind of things you want us to talk about, what kind of things you want to learn more about. So make sure that you get in touch with us. One of the ways is by sending us an email, and that email address is info@imagesinfocus.photo. Or you can reach us on our Facebook page, and that's Images in Focus as well. That's a Facebook group. I believe the URL is facebook.com/groups/imagesinfocus. But certainly you can go either to David's Facebook or my Facebook, and you'll be able to find your way to the Images in Focus group there as well.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for tuning in, and we can't wait to see you on the next episode.
Thank you guys for tuning in. Take care until next time.